Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome again to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. I'm Derek Ronista. I'm one of the emerging technology librarians. Before we introduce our speaker tonight, a couple little quick notes in case you're interested in some of our wonderful programs. Wednesday, October 22nd at 6:30 p.m. in person, we have with us the former head of the FBI, and he's written a wonderful book called Art, Crime, Team. Tim Carpenter. He's the author of The Grave Robber, the biggest stolen artifacts from the case of FBI history and their Bureau's quest to setting things right. So again, that's Wednesday, October 22nd at 6:30 at the library in person. Another in-person program we have is Wednesday, November 5th at 6:30. It's in person again. Professor and NBC News International analyst Michael McFall. He's the author of Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. So again, that's Wednesday, November 5th at 5 p.m. at 6:30. And also, in case you're curious about more programs here, either virtual or in person, go to hudsonlibrary.org and you can wonder about what else is coming out. So a quick little shout out to our local bookseller, the Learned Owl, if you'd like to purchase this book here. We'll put a link in the chat, so if you'd like to purchase that, you can go ahead and click on the link. And afterwards, we will have time for some questions. So there's a little Q&A button at the very bottom, so go ahead and click on that and ask some questions, and don't be shy. So let's introduce the author. So tonight we have us Nathalia Holt, and she's going to be talking about her newest book, The Beast in the Clouds. And she has her PhD in molecular biology, studied at the University of Southern California, Tulane University, and Harvard University. She is a former fellow at the Rangan, I think, Institute of MGH, MIT, and Harvard University. Some of the books she also has written, The Rise of the Rocket Girls, The Queens of Animation, Wise Gals, The Spies Who Built the CIA and Changed the Future of Espionage, and Cured, How the Berlin Patients Defeated HIV and Forever Changed the Medical Science. She has also written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, the Slate, Popular Science, PBS, and Time. And she's coming to us from California. So I'll turn it over to the author.
Thank you so much for listening to me tonight. I am excited to share with you a forgotten corner of history. And this is an expedition that the two eldest sons of President Theodore Roosevelt took to China and Tibet in 1928 in search of a mythical animal, the giant panda. And this is a story that is exciting. It's an adventure, there's mystery, but it also tells us something about the legacy of the Roosevelts and their impact on wildlife conservation. Now, it might be hard to imagine, but there was a time when the existence of pandas was in doubt. And this is surprising because for most bears, such as brown bears, black bears, and polar bears, they had long been known to humans. Even polar bears who lived in the Arctic had been part of the zoo in Alexandria in 3rd century BC and part of the Tower of London's menagerie in 1252. But pandas, however, were unknown. They were the last large mammal unknown to science. And even the earliest depictions by Westerners of the panda were kind of ridiculous. They were tigers, they were tapirs. Even in China, because it's such a vast country and pandas were in such a remote part of the country, the panda was known as this mythical creature. It was described as a yellow and black bear that munched on iron. Now, this changed for Westerners in 1869 when a French missionary named Armand David was found an interesting animal presented to him by some hunters while he was living in China. And this animal was the pelt of a small cub. It was black and white. And so he sent it to the Natural History Museum in Paris, and he sent it along with this note that said, quote, "I have not seen this species in the museums of Europe, and it is easily the most pretty I have come across. Perhaps it will turn out to be new to science." In Paris, they really didn't know what to make of this cub. It had such striking coloration, the black and white, that some scientists thought it was all a fraud. They thought it had been dyed to look this way. It was hard for them to believe that this was real. Now, other expeditions went out, but none of them were able to bring back a panda. And so decades passed, and then in 1919, an American missionary named Joseph Milner sent an interesting specimen to the Natural History Museum in New York City. And this was a pelt of the giant panda that he had purchased in China. And the museum announced it by saying it was, quote, a giant panda from eastern Tibet, one of the rarest of animals. Almost nothing is known of the animal's habits, but it is said that it feeds on roots and the young shoots of bamboo. Milner himself couldn't contribute any more details about the panda. He didn't know where it lived, what it ate, what its habits were. And so immediately explorers became interested. And this was now the 1920s, and explorers were going to the far reaches of the globe in search of discovering the highest mountains and the Arctic, the deepest trenches of the ocean. And the panda immediately caught the imagination. There was evidence now that the panda must be real. And so dozens of expeditions with trained scientists went out to China, they went out to Tibet. They all returned empty-handed. This occurred for almost a decade of expeditions going out and returning with nothing. And at this point, many people and even scientists began to think that this was all a hoax. They began to think that the panda couldn't possibly be real. Now, in 1928, the two eldest sons of President Theodore Roosevelt, Ted and Kermit, decide that they're going to try their luck. They're going to go to Tibet and China in search of the panda. And people don't expect much from them. At this point, so many scientists have gone out and have not found the panda. But Ted and Kermit, of course, have the advantage of going on expeditions and learning so much from their father. And Teddy Roosevelt was this larger than life figure. And he had advantages and disadvantages as a father if you were one of his children. He was certainly a very affectionate father. He was the kind of dad that would get down on the ground, he would play with his sons, he played boisterous games, he chased them around the around the house. He loved to play this game that he called Bear Hunt, where they would chase him and jump on his back. He wrote them long letters. He would give them these beautiful pictures he drew, and he told them repeatedly how much he loved them. On the other side, though, there were disadvantages because Teddy Roosevelt could put a lot of pressure on his children. And we see that with Ted, who was the eldest son, and at 10, he had a near nervous breakdown. And the doctor told Teddy Roosevelt that he was, quote, overwrought from trying to live up to his father's excessive expectations. Things were not easy for Kermit either. His father often worried that Kermit would grow up to become a weakling, and so he urged him to be tough. Now, the brothers grew up, and they wanted to follow in the footsteps of their famous father. Ted decided to join politics, and he became the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1921. Now, this was a position his father had held before him, but in the 1920s, he became embroiled in what was called the Teapot Dome scandal. And this scandal involved politicians taking money in exchange for valuable oil leases. And it tainted Ted's career. And so that when he ran for the governor of New York, the scandal followed him. And in fact, FDR, his cousin, and Eleanor Roosevelt campaigned openly against him. Eleanor Roosevelt even drove around in a car fashioned with a giant teapot to remind voters about the scandal. As you can imagine, Ted lost this election, and he was, as his wife put it, politically obliterated. Kermit was also struggling during his 30s. He was having a hard time with his business. He was not a natural businessman, and he was having a hard time at home too. So for both brothers, when they decided to go on this expedition, there was a real feeling that they were escaping. And this was behavior that in many ways they learned from their father. Teddy Roosevelt very famously in 1909 went with his son Kermit on an African safari, at a time when he was frustrated with Washington, when he was angry at his successor, President Taft, and he saw this as a way to escape that environment. He also accompanied Kermit Roosevelt, again, his son, in 1913 after he lost his bid for the presidency, running from a third party. And this was an expedition to the River of Doubt in South America. And once again, he used an expedition as a way to escape what was a difficult and hard situation. And so the idea that the two sons of Teddy Roosevelt were going on an expedition like this as a way to get free from their daily lives makes a lot of sense when you look at what their father did. But in a sense, they were doing a lot more than that as well. They wanted to continue their father's legacy. And since politics and business was not working out, environmentalism, expeditions, travel, this was a real way that they could honor their father. Now, their expedition was funded by the Field Museum in Chicago, and they were able to assemble a small team of scientists and naturalists to accompany them. Here's Sudham Cutting. He was a naturalist in New York City. He was not particularly experienced, but he was a good friend of Ted and Kermit's. And he was the kind of man who could just be counted on to pitch in for whatever was needed. He did not have a big ego. He was happy to just help out. And he went on the expedition along with his cameras. And so he was able to capture film from the trail that shows the people and the cultures and the places that they traveled through. This is Ty Jack Young. He was 19, an NYU student who the Roosevelts hired as an interpreter and as a naturalist on the trip. And I was able to obtain the unpublished autobiography of Young, as well as some interviews that he did in the 1990s. And this gives us such a valuable perspective of what it was like for this young man who was really just awed by the Roosevelts. He thought so highly of them and he so much wanted to learn from them. Now, Young has an interesting history. He was born in Hawaii. His father was from San Francisco. His mother was from China. He was mostly raised in China. But on the expedition, he talks about how he feels he's from neither nation. He feels adrift. And it's interesting to look at his future, what he becomes, because as he grows up, he becomes an American hero. He becomes a brigadier general who earns the Congressional Medal of Honor as well as the Medal of Freedom, many other awards. And in addition to that, he is a close personal friend with the Roosevelts for the rest of their lives. There was also Herbert Stevens. Now, Herbert Stevens was a PhD from the UK. He was the real scientist in the group. He had experience with this kind of expedition, and he documents his story in a book he published Through Deep Defiles to Tibetan Uplands. And in this book, he talks about how, quote, where others had to hurry, I should have to tarry. And this describes his style perfectly. Stevens was obsessed with nature. He was very easily distracted. And in fact, on the very first day on the trail, he becomes lost. The entire expedition has to stop what they're doing and go in search of him. And this is a very humorous moment. But what happens on the trail is that he ends up going so slowly that he has to trail the expedition by himself. And although you would not think this would be easy, you certainly would not expect him to be successful, his contributions to biology are really unparalleled on this trip. Now, here's a map that the Roosevelts had made of their expedition. So they started in Burma, which is today Myanmar, and this was an area that they called the back door of China. So they're going through here, traveling 1,000 miles across southwestern China. They're going through Tibet and China, straddling the border. And because there were so few maps of this region, they very frequently did not know what country they were in. This area had almost no roads. There were no vehicles that could travel there. And so that meant that all the goods that went to this part of China and Tibet had to travel by foot on trail. And so this was a common sight on the trail. The brothers and the other expedition members often saw men and women carrying hundreds of pounds of tea on these very rugged mountain trails. Now, this was a time of immense change in China. They were in the midst of a civil war. And because of this, the Roosevelts encountered both active fighting and bandits who were concealed on the trail. And these were often soldiers who had fled their own armies. And there's one very exciting moment in the book where a group of female guides are moving through this remote mountain pass. And you can think of these guides similar to the Sherpa people of Nepal. So these are individuals who are very skilled in mountaineering. They are great at navigating the mountains, making camp, they carry equipment, they make food, and over half of the guides for the Roosevelts were women. And I found this very interesting because Ted even describes this as, quote, the land of women's emancipation. So, a group of female guides were leading the expedition one day on the trail when suddenly they were surrounded by bandits who were pointing their guns at them. The women acted quickly, and one of them immediately struck a nearby mule, which caused chaos. It caused the bandits to fly away, and the women ended up chasing them. And by the time the Roosevelts caught up with the group, they really couldn't even understand the danger that they had been in. So the expedition started in tropical jungles, it goes through rivers, and eventually they make their way into the snowy Himalayas. Now, at this point in time, nobody knew what was the tallest mountain in the world was. And so Ted and Roosevelt often pondered whether the mountains that they saw and that they were moving through might actually be the tallest mountain. It certainly felt like it to them, especially as they began to suffer from altitude sickness. And there are a couple of really scary moments on this expedition. One of them occurs at 17,000 feet elevation, and both Ted and Kermit are waking up every hour in the night, just gasping for air. They're clutching their heads in pain. They are completely miserable. They don't know if they're going to survive the night. A blizzard descends, and their mules who accompany them on their trail, the mules are the ones who carry equipment and they carry their food. And on one morning, after they wake up from altitude sickness, they find that all the mules have fled. There's no longer any food left in the camp. They immediately go out into the mountains, into the snow. They're desperate to find them because they know that the nearest town is more than a week away. They cannot survive unless they find these mules. But despite their searches, they can't find them. They're left with nothing. And the only way that they're able to survive this moment is because of a group of Tibetan monks who were known as lamas. And these lamas lived together in lamaseries, which are like monasteries. They were men and women, and they often served as doctors in the region. And so when they encountered the Roosevelts, they took them in, they fed them, they replenished their supplies. And in addition, they even patched Kermit's jacket, which had holes in it, with their own saffron colored robes. And Kermit would joke that he was now part llama. So this area that the Roosevelts are moving through, it is a patchwork of autonomous regions of Tibet, each of which has its own culture and language and traditions. And so because of that, the Roosevelts are encountering many interesting parts of the world that had not been described by Westerners before. And one really interesting story in the book takes place in the kingdom of Mulai. And here the Roosevelts meet with the guardian of the eastern border, who can be seen with his eyes closed here in the center of this picture, and his son, a toddler that you can see here, who is the future king of Mulai. And as the Roosevelts are introducing themselves, they tell the guardian of the eastern border that they are the sons of President Roosevelt. And the man replies, "Who is President Roosevelt? He has never heard of him." This is an experience that Ted and Kermit have not had before, and it is liberating. And what you can see is that all those expectations that they so frequently have put on themselves are now gone. And as they move through this area, they're able to make friends very easily. They stop at every village, they talk with hunters, and it's a freeing experience for them. And they describe that in their journals and letters from the trip. So the Roosevelt expedition is moving across Southwest China. They're going over 1,000 miles through all of these different parts of China, meeting all of these different cultures. And they're able to collect an incredible number of new species. And in the book, I described some of those. There are some really fun plants they find, such as the Himalayan snowball plant, which almost looks like a sea anemone, and it can only be found at high elevations in the snowy Himalayas. They're able to collect thousands of bird species. There are reptiles, there's invertebrates, small mammals, 40 big mammals, and they ultimately document 19 new species. But the panda, the elusive bear that they want more than any other, is evading them. And this is very frustrating for them because wherever they go, nobody has ever heard of the panda. Nobody has any idea what they're looking for. And so the Roosevelts, out of desperation, after 6 months of this has passed, they decide to do something that they really don't want to do. They decide to go to an area that was called the Land of the Yi, or Lolo Land. And this was an area ruled by an independent people who are known as Lolos, or the Yi. And naturalists had warned the Roosevelts, do not go there. They had told them that the Yi were savages that would kill them, and that this was not a safe place. The Roosevelts decide that they're going to go anyway. And so they go into this remote, autonomous state. Basically, the Yi are independently ruling their own kingdom. They have their own language, their own culture, and they are fiercely anti-Chinese. So when the Roosevelts first appear among them, they are suspicious, especially because both Ted and Kermit have very bushy, long beards at this point, and the Yi people suspect them. And one of the translators makes this clear to Ted and Kermit, and he tells them, quote, they think that you are holy fathers. So essentially, the Yi people thought Ted and Kermit were Catholic priests that were there to convert them. And so the Roosevelts have to explain, no, we are explorers. We're here to find the panda. And to their surprise, this group of Yi people they have met know about the panda. They have seen it before, although very rarely. Most importantly, though, they do not hunt this animal, and they try to explain to the Roosevelts that this is actually a gentle bear. This seems crazy to the Roosevelts because the thinking at the time is that the panda, because it's black and white, is an aggressive animal. They expect it to be a mix of the black bear and a polar bear, and they really think that this is going to be one of the most aggressive animals on Earth that they are hunting. The Yi people, although they try to explain this, it doesn't work. The Roosevelts are desperate to find the panda. And so a group of Yi hunters agree to take the Roosevelts out to find the panda. Now, the reason they do this is not because they condone hunting a panda, but it's because they themselves see panda so rarely that they believe it's unlikely they'll even encounter one. They figure they'll go out for a couple of weeks with the Roosevelts, they won't find one, and then eventually they'll come home and everything will be fine and they'll make a little money in the meantime. So the group sets out, and everyone is shocked when they do actually find a sign of the panda. There are some scratches in a tree and even some black and white hair that is left behind. A little while later, they see paw prints in the snow. And now the Yi hunters are very upset. And they tell the Roosevelts, no, we're not going to go on. We can't do this. We're not going to actually kill a panda. And the Roosevelts argue with them. They eventually convince a small number of the hunters to keep on going with them. And after a very long and snowy march through a bamboo forest, they come across a giant dragon spruce tree. And this is what this kind of tree looks like in China. Suddenly, a panda sticks its head out of a hole in the tree. The two brothers raise their rifles and they shoot at the animal. And to their surprise, the panda does not turn around. It's not aggressive with them. Instead, it flees into the woods, and the Roosevelts trail it and ultimately kill the animal. And this is a picture from that scene. Almost immediately, the Roosevelts have regrets. And what we see is that in their journals, they speak about how the Yi people were right. and Kermit describes the panda as a gentleman. And as they reach the end of their trail, these regrets will only intensify, especially when they bring the panda back to the United States, because this sets off a frenzy. Suddenly, people are really excited about the panda. Here is proof the panda is real. Not only that, but you can see it. They have an exhibit set up at the Field Museum where you can see the Roosevelt's panda. And soon, all the other museums in the West and in China want their own panda exhibits to attract visitors. And in addition to that, the panda is known as the most challenging trophy animal on Earth. That is how it is described at the time. And so you have hunters who are then using the Roosevelt's map and their information to go to China and kill their own pandas. Not only that, but you also now have individuals who are headed to China and they want to trap a cub to bring back to zoos in the United States. And the first person to do so was a woman named Ruth Harkness, who you can see here. So thanks to the Roosevelt's map, she was able to find this cub and bring it back to her hotel room in New York City, where she then auctioned off this panda cub to the highest bidding zoo. And while she was in New York, the Roosevelts met with her in the hotel room, and they were horrified by what they found. And in their journals and in their letters, you can see how upset they were at this moment. And there is a particular instance that really gets them. And this is when Ted is holding the panda cub in his lap. And a man in the room says to him, maybe one day this cub will be stuffed and sit among your pandas in the Field Museum. And Ted says, I would sooner stuff my own son. He is so upset at this idea, and it's suddenly very clear what they have done. Because they've discovered the panda, they have set off all of these people who are going to China and who are desperate to have their own. And they know how rare the bear is. So what has happened is really upsetting. And because of this, they decide they're going to make some real changes. And sadly, the cub that Ruth Harkness brought back from China does not live even a year, which really says something about how little zookeepers understood about pandas. I mean, so little was even known then about what was happening with these animals. And today it is stuffed and does sit alongside the Roosevelt's animals in the Field Museum. So Kermit in particular makes some big changes in his life. When the Roosevelts return to the United States, they have many offers to go back to China and hunt more pandas. They're offered a lot of money to do so. There are a lot of museums that would love to have their own Roosevelt pandas in their halls. However, Ted and Kermit decline all of these invitations, and they really decide that they're no longer interested in hunting animals in general. And what we see is that Kermit ends up taking instead an expedition to the Galapagos Islands with another member of the expedition, Sudum Cutting, and the two of them are going to study the endangered Galapagos tortoise. And they do not kill the animal, they do not bring it back for zoos. Instead, they initiate a breeding program to try to save this animal. After that, Kermit joins the New York Zoological Society and then becomes president of the Audubon Society. And there he presses for protections for many animals. But he and Ted are very focused on gaining protections for the panda because they can see what's happening around them. And so they work with their connections with Chinese officials. And in 1938, China bans all hunting and trapping of the panda. Now, this is a big deal. There are no other animals that have these kind of protections. The panda is the first game trophy animal to get this kind of ban. And it's really thanks to Ted and Kermit and the work they did during this time. And even more than that, their work at this period is really about not just the panda, but about getting conservation for many different animals. Because not only did they change the laws, they changed the thinking about conservation. So before the panda expedition, what we see is that scientists believed that if you had an animal that was endangered, you should kill it. So that way it could be studied and documented for science. This really was the thinking at the time, and scientists would go out and take as many endangered animals as they could. But after the expedition, Ted and Kermit challenged this thinking because they knew how rare the panda was. And so they ushered in this new era of conservation and of protecting endangered species that really would just not exist without them. And it really says a lot about how passionate they were about the panda and about animals in general. Now, both Ted and Kermit served in World War II, and Ted has, at this point, he's 56. He is walking with a cane, and he is the only general to land with the first wave of troops on D-Day. He famously says, "Let's start the war from right here." Sadly, at the time, he was hiding a heart condition. And so, about a month later, he passes away, and he was later awarded the Medal of Honor. Kermit was also in World War II. He was stationed in Alaska, and it was there, sadly, that he decided to take his own life, and he was just 53 years old. But the legacy of the Roosevelts, of course, goes so much farther than that. And by writing this book, I hope to shed a light on the work the Roosevelts have done for conservation and for biology, because today pandas are a symbol of that. They are our symbol of conservation. They are doing so well in the wild today. They've had a real bounce back from low levels they'd had previously. And it's really thanks to the Roosevelts that we know about this animal and that we appreciate it and that we continue to work to save endangered species around the globe. Thanks so much for listening to my story about the Roosevelts and this very remarkable journey that they had. And, I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Okay. All right. I think we'll take some questions here. So don't forget, there's a little Q&A button. You can go ahead and ask that. So I think you kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, but the 1920s is kind of an age of exploration, or something of that nature. Why do you think that is? Is that because people now have airplanes and they can get things quicker? There's radio, there's moving picture, and all that stuff. Why are people so excited about visiting the corners of the globe?
I think at that time there was so much we didn't know. We didn't know Everest was the tallest mountain. We didn't know which part of the ocean was the deepest. So much of the Arctic was still unexplored. There were so many jungles and rivers still to be discovered. And animals, especially. When we look at the animals that we are still discovering today, so many new species, it is really remarkable. You can see how people are drawn to these explorations.
Yeah, so we have a question that asks about Teddy Roosevelt and FDR. What did they think about the individuals in their book, their efforts?
Um, for FDR, I guess I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Oh, yeah, it just says, what did Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delaware Roosevelt think about the two Roosevelt brothers that you mentioned, their efforts and everything?
Obviously, Teddy Roosevelt was very proud of his sons, and I talk a lot about their relationship and what that was like in the book. It was so interesting to me researching this book because the Roosevelts talk much about their relationship with their father while they're in the mountains, while they're on this expedition. It's very clear their dad is constantly in their thoughts. Now, FDR is interesting because he's obviously their cousin, but their relationship was not close. And of course, we see that when Ted is running for governor of New York and FDR is campaigning against him. But we also see it after they come back from the expedition when FDR is elected. There is a lot of bitterness between Ted and FDR. There's a less with Kermit. Kermit was able to bridge that gap more successfully, and I think that made Ted even angrier. He was really upset that they were kind of able to reconcile somewhat. So yeah, it's certainly it's fascinating and it's multifaceted. I mean, I think you could probably write a book just about that relationship. It gets
Uh,
complex.
I'm sure. Speaking about the Roosevelts, what's the most important thing that surprised you maybe the most about the brothers during this research project? Anything really that just made you go, wow, that's amazing?
There's so many things. I think, I went into it thinking so much about the advantages that Ted and Kermit had as the sons of President Roosevelt that I didn't really think about the disadvantages as much and how hard it was for them. And I was just shocked by their long relationship with Jack Young. Like, here was a 19-year-old they had no connection to. There was really no benefit in that close friendship. And yet their letters and Jack Young's autobiography reveal how close they were. They really stayed in touch for the rest of their lives. Both Kermit and Ted sponsored Jack Young's first solo expedition. They obviously cared about each other, and that was very heartwarming.
Uh, Somebody has a question about the pandas in the wild. They're doing well. Are they still considered endangered, or they're kind of like a little, they're still under protection?
So in the 1970s, there were less than 1,000 pandas. Today, thankfully, those numbers are back up. Today, there's more, like around 3,000, we think, in the wild. And so they're no longer considered endangered, but this is a very rare bear. This is not an animal that is found often. And while I was researching the book, I spoke with many scientists who study the panda, and they told me that the most difficult part about studying pandas in the wild is simply finding one. I mean, it really goes to show that it's always been quite difficult to find pandas in the wild, both 100 years ago and today.
We have a question about their father, Theodore Roosevelt. Where was he at this time during this time period?
So he died in 1919. So he was not alive during this time period. But I did find it interesting how much he was in their thoughts. It's very clear that that connection was important to Ted and Kermit. And so in the book, I do talk somewhat about what it was like for them when he passed and how that influenced their behavior moving forward. And I probably should have talked about that tonight because it certainly was an influencing factor for why they even decided to go on this expedition in the first place.
So we have a question, and we were chatting a little bit before we went live about some of your archives or libraries or anything you used that was really helpful in this project. Can you kind of briefly, I know you consult a lot of things, like what was some of the coolest things that you found and what was like the best place that you visited?
Oh, there's so many great places. I think for writing this book, I really wanted it to feel immersive. I really wanted it to feel as if you were on the trail with the Roosevelts. And in order to get that kind of detail, you need a lot of research material. And so I was really fortunate to be able to obtain journals and letters and interviews from each member of the expedition. And that really allowed me to recreate each scene in a lot of detail. And it was fun for me because occasionally they disagreed and I sort of had to parse out, well, what really happened at this moment? But just to be able to get so many different perspectives on these moments in the trail was really fascinating, and it was such a great way to research the book.
So how long did it take somebody, let's just say the Roosevelt brothers, to get to China? Because nowadays obviously you can get on a plane and things like that. But was there a direct route? Did they take a plane? Did they take a boat? How did they sort of get there?
Yeah, there is definitely not a direct route. They actually took a boat to Europe first, and they got supplies there that then they brought around the long way, all the way to Burma, and to be able to start the trail from there. And I think it's remarkable. It's so many months just to get to the start of the trail. And then when they get there, they're going entirely by foot. They have mules that are able to carry supplies. But this trail of 1,000 miles, it can only be traveled by foot. And it's just so remarkable, when you think about what that area looks like today, it's completely different. That trail does not exist anymore. It is really just a vanishing world that they went through.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about the unpublished autobiography of Jack. How did you hear about this or come about this? This is pretty fascinating stuff.
Yes, fortunately, his daughter, Jolly Young, has kept all of his letters and his memoir and many other of his materials. And so she was gracious enough to share some of those with me. I was also able to get these interviews that he had done with another author and journalist in the 1990s. And that was amazing to me. I mean, imagine to be able to actually hear the voice of someone you were researching and writing about, and to have them describe these events and to have them describe the Roosevelts. It was really remarkable. And I feel like Jack's perspective is so valuable in this book because he is young. He's only 19. He's impressionable. He's seeing things for the first time. And his view, I just found so interesting. He often remarks about people and places in a way that's very different than the other explorers.
Um, so speaking of, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, Sudyam, I hope. He did get a little bit of a travel bug afterwards, and he kind of touched upon that. Is there any reason why? Did he just love exploring and looking at all the wonderful little things around him?
He fell in love with Tibet after this trip. He absolutely fell in love. He was determined to go back. He had many offers to go back and hunt panda, and he refused all of them. He was not interested even in animals anymore. He decided he was really interested in people and in cultures. And so he ends up using a permit that the Roosevelts were able to get to enter Tibet, which was not easy to get. And he takes that in order to go back. And he goes back several times. He develops a real correspondence and relationship with the Dalai Lama. And that's really what he is best known for. Nobody would ever really think of him in terms of pandas or the Roosevelts necessarily. He is known as being this man that went to Tibet and documented so many cultures.
Yeah. So speaking of the Roosevelt brothers, there's a question that, do you know any good biographies about either of them that really would be interesting to learn about their lives in detail?
Yes, there are a few. Unfortunately, there are not that many to choose from. But I was really impressed with the work that has been done. There's a great one on Ted Roosevelt, and there's another one on Kermit that's called In the Shadow. It's, I think that's the title. I'm forgetting the title now. But I can certainly share it with you, and you can add it to anyone who's interested, or you're able to contact me directly. But it really is a very deep look at Kermit Roosevelt and his life, which was complex. I'm only able to get into part of it in this book, and there's certainly a lot more detail to be said there. I also felt like for Kermit Roosevelt, there is a lot of great detail that can be found in River of Doubt, where he's accompanying his father, and Candace Millard, the author of that book, is able to she puts in a lot of his letters and his writings about that time. And there's a great book called His Father's Son that's about Ted Roosevelt that goes into a lot of detail about his life and what an incredible life. I mean, I barely touched on it. There's another book that Ted's wife wrote, and it's called Clearing Strange Ports, I believe. And it's really interesting because it's all from her perspective of what their life was like together. And I just found it such an interesting way to look at things.
Yeah. I wrote this down, so I think this might be the one you're thinking of. Is it Trailing the Giant Panda? Was that the one story that talks about their expedition?
Yes, so that is the original book that the Roosevelt brothers published in 1929. So it's not the biography of Kermit Roosevelt that I was trying to remember, just in the shadow of something. But it's Trailing the Giant Panda is a very valuable account because it's their account that's really stolen from their journals on the trail. And because it was published right after the expedition, it really gives you a lot of detail right from their memories. But I will say it's missing a lot because the Roosevelts obviously wanted to show some bravado. So they don't show as many of their vulnerable moments. They don't show as many of their doubts as they do in their journals and in their letters. And so there's a lot of detail that I was able to bring to the story that's sort of helpful to give context as well as the experiences of the other explorers, which are also very helpful in understanding the expedition. So Trailing the Giant Panda is just a really interesting account of their work, but it certainly is missing some context as well.
Okay. There was a question. Somebody's wondered, have you been to China before?
I have been to China. Yes, my grandfather lived there for over a decade. And I took Mandarin in college, so I've been fortunate to travel to China a few times. And it's, I wish I could recreate this trail. And not that I would necessarily want to experience all the difficulties the Roosevelts did, because, oh wow, that would be hard. But I can imagine that just to encounter some of the places they went to would be really interesting.
So who had the first panda? What nation and what year? In a zoo, I should say.
So That would be the United States that had a panda in a zoo that would be before China, and that was actually the Field Museum. It didn't live for very long, and so it's actually very sad when you look at that history because all of the cubs that were brought to the United States during that period, this is the 1930s, none of them lived very long. The zoos simply did not really know how to take care of them. And so it's, within 10 years, you'd already lost all of those cubs. Oh, it's just heartbreaking, really. And, there is some controversy even today about how well we do at taking care of pandas. Breeding in zoos is actually not as successful as pandas in the wild. The lifespan of pandas in zoos is considered less than pandas in the wild. So in the book, I make a strong argument for preserving the panda and preserving its natural habitat.
You talked a little bit about the difficulties of breathing. It's altitude sickness is what we would call that. Did they understand that back then? Did they know what was going on and they couldn't do anything about it?
Yes, they absolutely did.
Oh,
They weren't able to carry supplemental oxygen like mountaineers do now, but they were aware of what was happening. And it certainly was such a struggle. I mean, it's what Ted and Kermit called the very worst night of their lives was that moment where they're suffering from really bad altitude sickness. And even their guides, so even the people that are accompanying them who typically don't have altitude sickness because they're used to being in that environment, even that night they were suffering too. So it really gives you some insight into just how bad it was.
so there's a question about Kermit after the expedition. I think you touched upon it, and then also it's in your book. But he worked for I think the New York Zoological Society. Is that right? He took up a position. Can you kind of briefly talk about that, and then his work on maybe conservation with animals and things like that?
Yeah, it's really remarkable how much Kermit changed his life after this expedition. He goes on this Galapagos trip, he joins the New York Zoological Society, and he begins working on protections for animals there. And then he becomes president of the Audubon Society. And all during these years, he is just passionate. He and Ted are working very closely with the Chinese officials that they know, and they're working to bring these protections for pandas. I really don't know if anyone else could have done it but them because they had the connections. They knew the people to talk to. But Kermit's doing a lot of other things as well. He had this column called President's Page, and it was so fascinating to read his writings from that time because he calls for protections of a lot of different animals. He calls for a ban for duck hunting in the United States, which made a lot of people very angry. But he becomes very passionate about preserving species, especially endangered species.
Amazing. So what happened to Jack after the exposition? What did he do? Did he come back to the United States? Did he travel? What did he do?
So Jack also deserves his own biography because his story is just incredible. He ends up really wanting to continue expeditions and he wants to become a scientist. He really just is so enjoys the science on the trail and he's very good at it. So he applies for a PhD program. He wants to become a PhD like Herbert Stevens. He's accepted into a program in Chicago where really he should have a very easy in, but they decide not to fund him, which they say is for budget reasons. In reality, it's almost certainly because of his heritage that he was not allowed to go there because they were hiring other people during that same time. And so he ends up joining the Explorers Club. He is really the first Chinese American to do so. And he goes on other expeditions. He returns to China. He ends up hunting panda once again, this time for the Chinese government so they can have a panda expedition in their zoo. And it was interesting to look at all of this history. What he really wants is his own scientific expedition. And both Sudam, Ted, and Kermit end up going together and making this happen because unfortunately, museums at that time really only wanted to fund white explorers. And so they were willing to pay very little for Jack and for his work. And so it's what unfortunately, just as he's about to do his own expedition, we have the beginning of World War II. And Jack ends up joining. He becomes part of the US Army. He becomes a brigadier general. And he has an incredible military career. I mean, the awards, what he's able to accomplish in the military is amazing. It really does deserve its own story.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So everybody's wondering, what are you working on next? What's interesting in history? Are you thinking about anything in particular?
I'm working on a new book, but it's still very early. But I love science and I love nature, and I just am very passionate about telling these stories from history that I think are important.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for spending your time here and talking about your newest book.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. So good night, everyone. Have a good evening, and thanks again for coming out. Yeah.